Hello, this is the next episode of the Exit Interview brought to you by Bizport. I'm Kyle Morioka, the co founder of Bizport, and we have a special guest, Carly Saffro. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining.
Yeah. And, I'm going to guess a lot of the guests you have and people you talk to never imagined that this is what they would be doing when they grew up. And that's kind of part of my story, but it makes a lot of sense in retrospect. So, long story short, I started my career in marketing, advertising on the agency side. I was pregnant with my first son and wanted to slow down. I loved my job, but it was a hustle and kind of a thankless job. And so I took a position as really like an office manager at a transportation technology company that was going through a very quick growth spurt. And when they did that, they needed someone to help them recruit because their entire team were, sales reps essentially. And I was the one person who had capacity. So this is back in the early 2000s. I'll date myself, but taught myself how to recruit in an environment where I learned and just observed the transportation logistics industry. I was with that company for 4 years, started with 8 employees when I joined. And when the company was sold in 2010, we had 120 some employees. So did a lot of recruiting over those years. And again, like this is before LinkedIn, this was Craigslist. And that's really how I sourced most of my candidates or hung up flyers in coffee shops. So 2010, my company was acquired. I stayed on, finished out a couple searches I was working on, but was not planning to join the new organization and kind of found myself out of a job. So at this point, I'm pregnant with my third son. I knew I wanted to work. I didn't really know how I was going to reinvent myself and get a job when I was, 5 months pregnant. So started just helping people using my experience in recruiting. I looked at a lot of resumes. I had some friends that, approached me and said they needed to hire and how could I help them or could I connect them to people and just, did it out of the goodness of my heart because I enjoy helping people. And maybe, 6 months in, my husband was like, you need to start charging. Like this is a valuable service you're providing. So I got the nerve to ask for a fee and started my business that way. I say I kind of started my business by accident because I never had a business plan. I never went out and got a loan. It was just, building on opportunity. And the rest is kind of history. I started CS Recruiting 2010, scaled my team, scaled our book of business. And that's, kind of what led me to where I am today.
Yeah. That's an awesome story, recruiting.
Hmm.
Your path kind of made sense where like you were at a different job. You were familiar with the industry, obviously, which I'm guessing is why you focus on transportation logistics at CS Recruiting. Yeah, and it kind of like turned into this like as a passion project. You're helping your friends and other colleagues and stuff, and then turn into a business.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'd say, I've always chased opportunities. So there was definitely a turning point where I had an opportunity to attend a meeting with some individuals that were scaling a logistics company. And I went into this meeting and they needed to hire like 200 people in 3 months. And they asked if I could do it. And I just, was incredibly optimistic, kind of faking it till I made it. And assured them that I could help them and left that meeting panicking, realizing that I could not do that alone. And that's what really prompted me to go out and hire my first employee. But it was just, yeah, chasing opportunity. If I saw, something I knew that I could deliver on, I wasn't going to let it die. I was going to figure out a way to solve the problem and, and be able to support them.
Yeah. If you had to pick one thing that was the most challenging part of growing your company, what do you think that would be?
It's a combination of, being undermined as a woman, especially in my industry. A lot of my early clients doubted me. I had a scenario where, a client I conducted a search, a successful search for them. And then I went to send my invoice and they called me and said, I know you're just starting a business and I'm glad, you were able to help me find this person. But because you're so small, I'm just going to pay half of your invoice and let's call it a day. And you know what? I just accepted that. And that was like a big learning for me that I didn't know how else to respond. And I didn't have that support. I didn't have like the legal support or an executive team backing me. So for some reason, I accepted that and allowed that. But when I look back and like that was a moment where all of a sudden I was like, that will never happen again. Like I know my value. And if we're gonna do business together, you're gonna pay me the fee that I quoted you. But I think that that happens quite a bit, just side comments and not only and always from men, but in transportation, logistics, supply chain, like dealing with a lot of big egos, very assertive men who would say like, "Well, what do you know about trucking?" And I had to prove myself, and I think that's, that is part of who I am. I'm always willing to prove myself, but give me a seat at this table for a reason, and I think you just have to, have that level of credibility and validation before you earn that seat. So it happened more than once, but that was definitely an early awakening.
Yeah. Wow, that is crazy though, like,
That's a great way
maybe
to put
that's
it.
like yeah, that's like the opposite side is, like, now you're, like, kind of trying to prove them wrong, like, "Hey, like, I got this," and then you build this, like, credibility and all these case studies over the years, and now it's like, "Yeah, I would never do that ever again."
Exactly. I think it started out proving it to myself. And I think like when I made that first placement and, collected a fee, that was the validation I needed to know that I could keep going, that I had something and, I provided this value. But then I think, yeah, there's that other side of it where now I have to prove myself to a hiring company. And sometimes in recruiting, your work is only as good as the person you place. And a lot of times they're going to leave this lasting impression or perception of you based on how they perform in the role. That's a hard part of recruiting is a lot of times like we're betting on someone else.
Right, right. Well, awesome. Thanks for sharing that story. I'm just curious, like, when did you start thinking about an acquisition or selling in general? Like, when did that cross your mind
Yeah.
first?
So I sold the business in December of 25. And if I'm being very honest, I did not think of exiting until December of 24. So about a year before the acquisition went through. And I know that's not traditional for a business owner. Along the way, I would meet people who would ask me what my exit plan was. And I would kind of just chuckle and say, like, I don't have an exit plan because I love what I do. And if I can wake up every day and do what I do and support, my clients and hire employees that also love what they do, then why would I ever exit? Why would I ever stop what I'm doing? And then, 2022, our industry, I think the economy took a turn, but our industry specifically really started to stall. And it's just, consumer behavior. When consumers stop spending, companies stop manufacturing and moving freight, and then they stop hiring. So 2022 to 2024, those were really hard years for any recruiters, but specifically in our industry. And I powered through it. I don't think I realized at the time that I was burnt and burning out over and over. I just, I had to show up because that's what I said I would do. And I had a team that relied on me and clients that, expected us to deliver. But those years really wore on me. And we started to come back in 2024. But there was a day, like literally a day that I woke up and I dreaded work. And I like thought to myself, I remember going on a walk with my husband and just saying, like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but like, I need to save myself and I need to, make sure I can show up as a mom and a wife and a friend and a boss, not just an entrepreneur. And so it was about a year before where I started just like putting the idea out into the world and not to get like all woo on the listeners, but I think that was kind of what it took is just me facing this truth and acknowledging that I was ready to consider an exit. And then once I did that, the conversation started, but specifically the conversation with Hirewell, who ultimately purchased CS
Yeah.
Recruiting.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, and I feel like it takes a lot of humility and, like, self-awareness to kind of realize you get to that point.
Yeah.
'Cause I've seen a lot of, like, founder friends who pass that point, or maybe they don't know that they're kinda past that point,
Mhm.
and then it's just kind of this, like, downward spiral of emotion,
Yeah.
but then you kind of recognize, like, "Hey, like, maybe this is the right timing for me, like, personally."
Yeah, and I think, like I said, like I grinded through it for years, and there were ups and downs, but I still loved what I did, even though it was hard. Until there was just a day where, I think it was probably a combination of like the emotional and physical wear and tear, and me just acknowledging that like I was not living my best life, and I was so consumed by work, but not in a way I used to be. I used to be consumed because I loved it so much, and now I was on a different side, just, feeling consumed because of the pressure and, waking up at 2 in the morning hoping, crunching numbers in my head, hoping I would make payroll, and that's part of being a business owner, but there's a point where, it really wear and tears on you.
Yeah, I feel that. I remember those days, the back of my hand.
Yep, exactly. If you've been there, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, huge hats off to you though, because I mean, I didn't have, kids to raise on top of running a company and growing it and stuff. So I can't even imagine like how difficult and strenuous that would be, like physically and emotionally and mentally.
Yeah, I have a very supportive husband and just a good, support system in general. But yeah, I mean, there's a time where you just realize like I'm giving, 200% to the business and not leaving anything for, the people and the things that are really most important.
Yeah. So it sounded like so in 2024, this was kind of when you had the initial idea of like, okay, I may consider selling my company. And then 2025, you mentioned December was the actual like, I'm assuming it's the closing date.
Closing.
You. It sounds like maybe it gave you enough time to like mentally prepare up until that
Yeah,
point. It's like how like overall how prepared did you actually feel like leading up to the sale?
that's a really good question. I think am proud of how I managed my own expectations in the sense that, like, I knew it was gonna be a process, and I also knew that, like, the day we closed was just the beginning. It was not the end, it was not the celebration. I still had, my employees that I needed to inform, and even though they all came over in the acquisition, like, lots of questions, and what does this mean for me? And we had to inform our clients and the job seekers, so I was very realistic that, like, we closed on December 1st. I was not, going to celebrate on December 2nd. Like, I actually knew that that's when it was gonna get hard. If I thought it was hard before, it was really gonna get hard, and that was true. Like, just the whole transition and integration and, holding my team's hands because I care about them and I wanted them to feel safe. But I do think, that year that I was, considering it and entertaining these conversations, I don't think I could have ever anticipated, like, I don't wanna say the grief. I'm not sure I have truly, like, grieved, but it is like giving a child up for adoption, and, like, and, in a lighter way. Like, I have children, and I know that would be much more serious, but that's kind of like what it felt like, is like you're excited at first, and you just go through a roller coaster of emotions. I think the hardest part of it that a lot of business owners don't talk about, and maybe, many of them have more support than I did because I kinda did it owner to owner, if you will, but, like, I still had a full-time job, and when you're selling a business, it's incredibly sensitive. I'm not a secret keeper, but yet I was keeping a huge secret from everyone for a full year. Obviously my husband knew, and there was one person on my team who knew. Beyond that, there's a lot of risk in sharing that information or even sharing that you're thinking about it. So I think that weighs on you a lot. And I don't think I anticipated this whole idea of like, I have a full-time job. In that year, I also had, two employees go out for maternity leave that, it was expected, but kind of unexpected. And I'm trying to do their jobs and I'm trying to sell a business, which undoubtedly is a full-time job that nobody realizes, just the conversations, the diligence, the negotiations. Like, it is an incredible amount of time and energy that you're not talking about, and you're not sharing why you're tired or why you're stressed, or anxious. It's just everyone just assumes like, you know, your work just got more stressful when there's a whole other backstory to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely feel that. And when I was selling my business last year, I felt the same way where I feel like there was a risk in like continuing to grow the business because I was spending so much time like talking with buyers, going through diligence and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So is it safe to assume that like it sounds like you didn't work with any brokers or M&A advisors through the process?
Not for the actual acquisition. Early, after my decision, I explored those routes and, had conversations with some different, business brokers, if you will, and different types of potential suitors. But for the deal that we ended up closing, I think it was pretty unique. I mean, you tell me because you talk to a lot of exited founders, but I owned my business and I was dealing with the owner of Hirewell that ultimately purchased us. And it was owner to owner, which, there's also a lot of emotions involved when, there's two people kind of protecting their territory and trying to come together on a fair agreement. So yeah, I'd say I had resources. I had a legal a team supporting me. I had my CPA very involved, but I did not have like a formal broker representing me.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And then were you speaking with other buyers, prior to Hirewell, or what did that look like?
Yeah, I think when I made the decision, I did not have a vision of who I would sell to from like a company type. And I did have several conversations that led me to realize that selling to another recruiting agency was the right move for many reasons. I had spoken to some suitors, I would say, in our industry that, let's say they're a consulting firm and they wanted our data and our book of business and me, but not my team and not our recruiting expertise. I talked to, a couple like adjacent companies, industry adjacent companies, and it was similar scenarios. Some of them were interested in my team, but there were a couple scenarios where like a PE group wanted to bring in a new owner who knew nothing about recruiting or a new CEO who knew nothing about recruiting. And that's when I just started to get the vision of like we have built way too much good stuff here to just hand over a book of business or not give my team an opportunity to keep doing what they're so good at. And that's what led me to really explore, selling to a larger recruiting firm or just another recruiting firm that didn't have the supply chain expertise that we did, where we could just kind of plug in. And that's exactly, what the plan was and what happened with Hirewell.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Okay. Yeah, it seemed like it was like the right fit, and you spoke with other buyers, but didn't really have that same one-to-one match.
Yeah,
Very
and
cool.
I don't think I didn't know what I didn't know at the time, but it's almost like, dating. It's like you go on a second or third date because they're nice and, it seems to be some chemistry, but then you meet the person and you're like, "Oh, this is what," I wasn't clicking. So, no, I think once I started really exploring other recruiting firms, that's where I kind of narrowed in my focus and knew that that would be the right move.
Yeah. Also, I love that you mentioned suitors because I just watched The Odyssey with my father, like, a few days ago, and then yeah, everyone's called, like, suitors in that movie.
Yeah, I
Is
saw
that
it.
what
Yeah, no, but that's exactly I think that's the easiest way to put it, like, yeah, they were we were courting each other, right?
Yeah, that's so funny. It's so accurate. That's why it's so funny.
Yeah, you picture, like, that room of all those men that were just waiting to get her attention, yep.
Okay, so you found the buyer, you're going through the process, you've kind of, nailed down the deal terms from negotiation. What was, like, your biggest worry about the process kind of walking into the whole kind of diligence process?
That it could fall through at any day, that, like, when if you're talking about the actual, the the year, let's say, that we were talking before we closed, just the acknowledgement that, like, I could back out and they could back out, and is this all for nothing? So, I think that's, an emotional roller coaster and, on both sides, like, it was kind of, assuring to me to realize, like, well, I could walk away at any moment, even with an LOI, I could still walk away at any moment, but then the other side is like, but so could they. Almost like an employer-employee relationship, you wanna stay in it and you wanna, be honest and fair and, make something big happen, but there's 3 sides to the story and, anyone can change their mind at any point. So, I think that was part of it, and then what I mentioned before, just I think this is unique to my situation, but when you talk about, like, the diligence, I had a right and a left hand, let's say, in my business. My 2 leadership peers, one of them adopted a daughter and that, we knew that she was going through the process. We did not know that, the baby would, be available when she was, and so that was a very unexpected maternity leave with, maybe a few weeks notice before she was out for 3 months. My other, my other leader, she had a baby very early and was out unexpectedly. So here I am, I'd worked really hard in the past couple years before I sold to get myself out of the trenches, to really be, a true leader, strategy focused and more in that macro view. And then all of a sudden I need to, provide documents for the diligence process. And I'm like fumbling through our drive and there's no one I can ask. And like, where's our comp plan? Or, you know what I'm saying? Like, where's our employee handbook live in this drive? And like things that like, I should know, but in fairness, like I built a team around me to support me with stuff like that so I could, move on to bigger and better things. And that was really hard for me. It's just, I probably wasted a lot of time like looking for old documents that someone else knew exactly where it was. I just wasn't if I would have asked them, it would have raised a red flag. And the resources that knew were just not available.
Right. Yeah, like, while keeping a secret.
Exactly, exactly. So things people don't talk about.
Right, right. Okay. And then, you go through that process, you close on December 1st.
Mhm.
It's been nearly 9 months now.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had a ton of time to kind of reflect and, see where you're at, and I'm sure there's some challenges too that now that you like, looking back, realize, "Oh, wow, like, I could have done this better," or whatever.
Yeah.
Or the major takeaways from the whole acquisition process.
One thing that Matt, the owner of Hirewell, kept saying to me is, "We're not gonna try and fix what's not broken. You guys have, you're doing a lot of things right that have gotten you to this point, and we don't want to mess with your brands. We don't want to mess with your, your subculture now of our organization." And he lived up to that, and I'm very grateful that of course, we had to eventually transition into their ATS and move technologies and integrate, but they gave us time. I think, we waited till Q2 where we felt really stable and everyone had like their new, talking points down and the new dynamic before we did anything too major. But I think the other thing and I can say this as a small business owner that like every single person that is affected needs individual attention. And I think that's almost underrated. Like, again, we were, in a position where, part of my mission was to make sure that my team had jobs and that they came over and, that they were a huge part of what made our company valuable. And so I had 15 employees at the time, and I knew that the minute I made that announcement, everyone would immediately think, "What does it mean for me?" And so I tried to like really get in their heads proactively and think like, "Okay, well this employee is going to care about this. This employee is going to care about this." And I was, as deliberate as I could have been on the day we closed and my leaders helped me at this point sharing the message in a full team meeting, but then carving out a half hour with every person and, having a one-on-one conversation, reiterating what I'd already said, giving them an opportunity to ask questions. But those questions, like it was exactly what I expected. But of course, like I didn't expect it to the degree that they were. But like some examples, I would talk to someone and they'd be like, "Well, I have a PTO day on Thursday, so can I still take my PTO?" And, it seems silly, but like, okay, that's a fair, valid question. Yes, you can take it, and let me explain what's going to change. Someone else on my team was pregnant, and her immediate reaction, I think she got very emotional when she heard because she's banking on a paid maternity leave and her benefits to have this baby. And so her questions were, what's going to happen to me and when I have my baby? And that one I was more prepared for because I knew she would ask that. So just making sure that like everyone's concerns are addressed and some of them you can address in more of a group setting and in a mass email, if you will. But everyone thinks about themselves and not in a selfish way. Like it's just something that I think if you are a small business owner and you know your people, like you have got to anticipate what everyone is going to think, feel, hear, and how that person can, it is your responsibility to make that person feel safe, especially if they're going to continue to be, a contributing member of the team, which was our case. So you can anticipate some of it, but not all of it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you were super strategic about it, and obviously, I don't know you super well, Charlie, but I can tell that you have a very strong emotional, like,
Yeah.
EQ.
Yeah.
You know people very
Yeah.
well. So, yeah, I mean, that's, like, way better than what I've seen pass, and, like, I feel like having that EQ sets you up for the transition being, a lot smoother versus, like, people running around with their hair on fire and, like, leaving the company and, then
Yeah.
the buyer starts asking questions like, "Hey, like, what did I buy if your employees are leaving?"
No, that's a great question, or that's a great point, and that was, something that, like, that was a big part of this transition is like, I'm counting on this team to keep doing what they do. I'm and knock on wood, we have not had anyone leave, since the acquisition, but that was something I thought about a lot is like any combination of people could depart. I'm glad we, have been able to retain them and given them a reason to stay. But then what does that mean? Because we still have goals to hit and, to be part of this bigger organization, like, we're coming in with a plan and that plan, won't be executed if half of our team isn't here or we need to spend time rebuilding the team. So that was a big part of I think we've always had this like human culture and just people first mentality, but making sure, to the best of my ability that like I wasn't being hypocritical. I was doing what I said I would do and, giving everyone individual attention because each person was equally important to our future success.
Yeah, yeah. Was there anything that you wish you did differently looking back now?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think there
Or
were a
you
lot of things
you
that were on
nailed it.
oh, yeah.
Sounds like you just nailed it too.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have done things differently, like, maybe I don't know if this is a lot of people would relate to this, but I definitely overthought. For that full year, I was spiraling. And, what if this happens? What if that happens? And if I didn't overthink, I would not have been prepared and I wouldn't have been able to anticipate, what did happen. But there were a lot of things that I probably overthought and stressed about unnecessarily that I was like, well, what if this happens? And, things that just, they could have happened, but it wasn't necessarily worth my energy and the amount of, like, mental capacity I gave it. So I don't know, it's like if you don't overthink, you could get yourself in big trouble, but I did have not a regret because I'm actually this was advice I would give. I did for many, many years, I thought about getting, like, an executive coach, and I didn't for whatever reason. It just felt like a, investment in myself that felt selfish when I'm trying to, run the business and, just keep my team rewarded. But I maybe middle of 2024, I invested in a coach, and I honestly am not sure I could have gotten through the whole acquisition without her. So that's no regret, more advice that, like, you need an unbiased outlet that you can vent to, that will give you advice, that will help you plan. And she just really helped me think through, every step of the way and what was important and how to prioritize and how to address some of these conversations. So very grateful that I, brought her into my orbit when I did, because if this would have happened years before, it would have been all on me and that would not have been pretty. I'm very glad I had that resource.
Okay. Other than getting an exec coach or this like unbiased person to kind of guide you through the process, are there any other kind of words of wisdom that you'd pass on to other founders that are, in the process of selling or thinking about selling?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we met until right after the acquisition, or maybe Kyle, like you had reached out to me and I was hush hush about it, that it wasn't a good time for us to talk or whatnot. I don't think I knew that firms like yours existed. And so maybe that is one, piece of advice is to really understand what type of support is out there. I did talk, like I said before, to a couple business brokers that, great people, and I was very confident that they could support us, but, a hefty upfront retainer when I wasn't even sure if I wanted to sell the business. And that just felt unreachable and like a silly, investment at the time. But I think if I knew that there were firms like yours that existed specifically in, our space that really understood our business, that would have been very helpful. And I think I just, yeah, I kind of did it the hard way because again, I didn't know what I didn't know. And things, even though it, was a year of conversation, it moved quickly. It's, and because I was balancing so many other things that I never really slowed down to say like, wait, can I do this alone? Or is there someone out there that can support me and, help reap the benefits without this upfront financial risk? So that's one piece of advice is just like really understand the market and your options and have people in your corner, because that's probably what made it the hardest for me is that it was, a pretty independent task.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure our audience will love that advice. Some closing thoughts since we're coming up on time here.
Yeah.
what are you up to next? I know you're still with Hirewell. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I went from being an employer to an employee after, 16 years of being the employer. I think a lot of people would look at that as like a demotion or a step back. And it where I am in my life, it's been very refreshing to, still be able to do what I do to kind of like find that passion for my work again without carrying all the responsibility. So right now I'd say I'm 90% there in terms of like shedding a lot of the leadership and ownership responsibility. There's still some things, little things I hang on to. Like I want to make sure our newsletters, still in my voice because it comes from me, but I'm not writing it from scratch anymore and I'm not curating the list anymore or overseeing that. So a lot of delegating, but it's kind of fun to see. I'm in a pure business development role now and just kind of learning like what I'm capable of. I've never considered myself a salesperson, but when I think back, like I did all the sales for my company in addition to carrying a lot of other things. And so it's kind of exciting to have a single focus and be in a sweet spot. And like this is, this is where everyone should get to this point in their career where they get to work in their sweet spot and have a very narrow focus that they enjoy. What's next? I don't know. I'm enjoying being an employee. Whatever I do, if I were to ever leave Hirewell, I would leave recruiting. This is definitely my last hurrah in recruiting, but I have a really strong network in my industry and so many, talented minds that can support me that, never want to let go of that and to continue to provide value and give back in some ways. That's really what I love most about my work.
Well, that's awesome. I'm sure, like, regardless of it's recruiting or some other industry, I think you just have the energy and fire and charisma to just like be successful at whatever you pursue. So
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
yeah. Well, thank you, Charlie, so much for your time. Appreciate you joining us today, and hope you have a lovely rest of your afternoon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Charlie.